Hello everyone, this is group 6 and our topic is about state capitalism, economic systems and the performance of state-owned firms. We are 4 members and I'm Vicky. Then we have Uju, we have Ugo, Chuku and Emmanuel. I'll take you through introduction. Then here we have a table of contents which shows what we're going to cover for this presentation. So start with introduction. The second person will go with the literature review, and then data and methods, the results, then conclusion, and finally we will show the relationship to Canadian economy. From the mid-1980s to mid-1990s, there was a consensus in global economic policy that was based around the view of privatization, liberalization, and macro-stability as the core of economic success. The Washington Consensus widely criticized this perspective, but behind the consensus was the view of economic systems, which to some extent is an intellectual hold in many developed economies, namely that of free market capitalism. Free market is the only system capable of generating sustained economic growth and efficiency, while capitalism is considered as a private ownership of means of production. However, as many other scholars have pointed out, the process of transition from socialism to capitalism in Central and Eastern Europe does not provide convincing evidence in support of the Washington Consensus approach to policy. Furthermore, in recent years, there is also new evidence emerging which brings into question the idea that there is only one systematic path to good economic performance. The rapid rise of the Chinese economy and other emerging markets, none of which conform to the traditional view of a free market economy. For instance, in a span of 39 years, that is 1978 and 2017, China GDP rose to just above $200 billion in 1978 and to more than $12,250 billion in 2017. Surely, there is evidence of sustained strong economic performance. Likewise, for the shorter periods, socialist economies like Vietnam and state-led capitalist ones such as Korea and Singapore experienced similar growth paths. With that being said, China is considered to be a state capitalist and not pure free market economy. The analysis of the effect of economic system needs to take into account the new institutional systems that guide economies of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. In this article, we will analyze the performance effect of state ownership at the enterprise level. The Washington Consensus argued consistently for the privatization of state-owned enterprises based on positive evidence at the time about the impact of privatization. Thus, Galal estimated net welfare gain of 26% of sales in Britain, Chile, Malaysia, and Mexico. We are also concerned with the relationship between economic system and farm performance. Our analysis is undertaken primarily in the context of emerging markets. From the variety of capitalism perspective, which is considered as Eurocentric, there are 2 fundamental systems within the market economy. First, the liberal market economies such as the UK and the US. Second, coordinated market economies such as Germany or France. These countries, unlike the socialist capitalist distinction, there is no institutional characteristics such as private ownership which is sufficient to define the system. However, the variety of capitalism approach remains highly Eurocentric and has not been systematically extended to consider the understudied emerging economies, which are the subject of this paper. To isolate the impact of state ownership on farm performance and to explore whether this is sensitive to institutional content, there are 2 fundamental research questions. First, are state-owned enterprises performing better than private-owned firms in a large variety of emerging markets? So to test this, we developed a unique dataset that combines the 7 FJAS configurations with the farm-level data from the World Bank Enterprise Survey, resulting in a sample of over 50,000 firms from 57 understudied countries. This includes emerging capitalist, former socialist, and state capitalist ones. Our results suggest that state-owned enterprises do display productivity advantages over private firms in these understudied economies. Second is the performance of state-owned firms in these understudied countries context-specific. To be specific, we are interested in whether state-owned firms perform better in the configuration, including China and Vietnam, which is termed as state capitalist. We find empirical support for the argument that the state-led configuration provide better institutional support for the ownership advantages of state-owned enterprises than all the others. Also, our findings indicate that the configurations are important determinants of both private and state-owned firms' performance.
I will be taking us on the effects of state ownership on enterprise performance and the moderating role of economic systems. So in this part of our presentation, we'll be looking at the effects of ownership structures on enterprise performance, and I'm going to be focusing majorly on developing economies, and this is because there is already an established argument which supports the fact that state-owned enterprises are less efficient. So this is going to lead us to explore two different points. The first point would be the relative performance of state-owned enterprises and private-owned enterprises in emerging economies. And the second point will be the contextual specificity of the relationship between enterprise performance and ownership structures. Starting with the relative performance of state-owned enterprises and private-owned enterprises in emerging economies, we realize that most scholars would usually support the argument that private-owned enterprises will perform better than state-owned enterprises. To help us understand this, we'll be comparing both ownership structures using two major factors. The first factor will be company objectives, and the second factor will be corporate governance. I'll be starting with the company objectives of private-owned enterprises. So the first factor we mentioned was profits. Private-owned enterprises focus exclusively on profits, and this kind of moves their attention to customer satisfaction and cost. Moving on to the company objective of state-owned enterprises, the first factor is profits. Yes, state-owned enterprises want to make profits, but they may also expect their managers to carry out personal objective, which is often either social or political. Due to this, I would say there's a conflict of interest, and I would say there's a conflict of interest in state-owned enterprises, and this will kind of make it harder for owners to specify targets and to monitor performance. So moving on to the next factor which was listed, corporate governance. From my research, I'll say that more work needs to be done to better understand the many aspects of the relationship between corporate governance and firm performance in emerging economies. Published research out there is quite limited, but because emerging market firms are generally affiliated with multiple networks connected by formal or informal ties, the structure themselves presents challenges for quantification and scientific data analysis. There is a major problem of asymmetry of information held by managers and owners about the performance of the firm. Outside owners, private or states, cannot have full access to information concentrated in the hands of manager. This causes a major problem in deciding whether poor results are as a consequence of unforeseen circumstance or as a result of managers exploiting profits for their own personal purposes. With that being said, I'm moving on to the next part of our presentation, which focuses on the impact of national institutional context with reference to the economic system. National institutional systems provide formal and informal rules of the game to which domestic and foreign firms must adapt their governance and ownership structures, not 1994. So we are curious, we want to know, why should differences in institutional systems explain firm performance? So the VOC literature, according to Hall, Soskice 2001, identifies the social democratic economic model of capitalism in North European countries as a variable alternative architecture of national competitiveness to liberal market economies, and proposes two principal mechanisms linking firm performance and institutional systems. The first principal mechanism he proposed concerns institutional complementarity, and he basically tried to explain that an economy has several institutional spheres, notably the financial, the sector, the labor, and industrial relation regime. So basically, institutional variation arises from the way different national institutional systems achieve cohesion and ways of hanging together to support high-performing firms and to achieve high economic growth. So I'm going to be moving on to the next key concept which he discussed, and that is isomorphism, which I'll be talking about on the next slide. I'm going to be moving on to the next key concept that he considered, which is isomorphism. What is the concept of isomorphism? Isomorphism is a concept that was developed by DiMaggio and Powell to help explain the tendency of organizations within a similar field to adopt similar behaviors, though reaching equilibrium and becoming increasingly similar to each other, particularly in terms of internal structure and processes. Each variety of capitalism is said to produce an emblematic firm, according to Boyer 2005, an organizational form particularly well adapted to its national institutional system. The emblematic firm in the liberal market economy, as we have already seen, is a capital market governed, managerially controlled, shareholder-owned, value-maximizing firm. Arguably, the state-owned enterprises may be the emblematic firm in the state capitalist system, according to Mosucho et al. 2015. The institutional system therefore supplies firms with the institutional capital so that the firms fit or become isomorphic with prevailing modes of institutional functioning. National institutional systems will differ in the way they influence the structure of emblematic firms and their capacity to accommodate non-emblematic firms and isomorphic processes in different configurations, therefore result in varied forms of comparative institutional advantage, according to Shenda et al. 2010, though as firms strive to access resources in their local environment, they are likely to develop similar practices adapted to their particular institutional configuration. Hall, Soskice 2001.
In this section, we will be describing the data and methods that were used to validate the hypothesis that we used throughout this paper. Our dataset is broken into three main dimensions. We have over 120,000 firms, more than 130 countries, and then the time frame of this data was between 2006 to 2016. This data together was what we used to run our regression model to see and test for our hypothesis. Table 1 is the summary of the classification scheme that was used in this paper. The classification scheme was developed by VIS Topology of Institutional System, and it includes countries that were surveyed by WBES. This VIS topology breaks down countries into different configurations, which are market-based, collaborative, state-led, fragmented with fragile states, family-led, centralized-led, emergent LME, collaborative, and hierarchy coordinated. Most of the developed economies can be seen in market-based, where we have countries like the United States, the UK, Canada, and Australia, while a lot of European countries like Germany, France, Italy are mostly collaborative. Also, we can see that emergent economies or developing economies are mostly scattered across the configuration and classification. I think this backs up our claim that developing economies don't really have a standard way at this moment, and because they are understudied, they tend to be described or classified based on few and not complete data. In table 2, we break down the countries into different configurations that have to do with emergent and understudied economies. So we had the state-led, the fragmented, the family-led, emergent, collaborative, and hierarchy. This didn't include the market-based because we've already said this is context-specific, and the market-based mainly talks about the developed economies. So in this table, we can see the frequency of firms in each of these countries under these particular configurations. Table 3 describes the definition of the measurement that was used in each of this research. First of all, we used productivity, which was defined as the real sales divided by full-time permanent workers. Exports, which is sales exported directly as a percentage of total sales. Then firm age, year of firm began operation to year of survey conducted. Then firm size, the log number of permanent workers, and percentage of FDI stock from developed economies. Percentage, which is defined as the percentage of FDI from developed countries to source economy. Also, we had the GDP per capita, which is the GDP divided by mid-year population. Also, we have some descriptive statistics which we can see on table 4. First of all, we can see that the firm age is on an average, is 17, and then the firm size is about 112 employees. Here we'll talk about the results of the regression model. We can notice that from model 1, that the country variables are all significant with the expected sign. And then also from model 2, the firm performance is significantly influenced by country. The coefficient on state ownership is found to be positive and significant in all the models in which it is included. This shows that in our sample of understudied economies, state ownership is found to increase labor productivity. In summary, our sample of understudied economies, we can see that state-owned enterprises and private-owned enterprises do not display significantly different level of labor productivity, and this holds true in every configuration except the state-led owned. However, in the state-led configuration, productivity is higher than state-owned firm. I think this shows that the Washington consensus isn't 100% correct, and private-owned enterprises are always better than state-owned enterprises, as it is context-specific.
In concluding this research work, the first research question was to determine if state-owned enterprise perform better than privately owned firms in a large variety of emerging markets. Now, this was tested using data from World Bank survey, drawing from pre-existing classification using what we call the Fireman's Job Analysis Survey. This taxonomy of institutional systems was tested and it was validated. Now, the second part of the research showed that the state-led configuration provides better institutional support for the ownership advantages of state-owned enterprise than private ownership. What this tries to explain is the fact that if an example like China is a state, most of the companies in China are state-led. Now you now have a situation where the rules and the regulations are being set by the state. Whatever company that is being state-run is definitely going to be favored and perform better than private ownership. Now, when this study was done, there's definitely going to be limitations to this study. The first one, you can classify the limitations based on theoretical and empirical. Now, theoretically, the study was limited in that the research based its classification of institutional system upon taxonomies. These taxonomies derive their classification from empirically observed clusters of characteristics rather than an underlying conceptualization. Another theoretical limitation was that the study was based on VIS classification, and this This particular VIS classification focuses only on complex interrelationship among these institutional systems and also enterprise governance system and firm performance. It just focuses on those three rather than putting other factors into consideration. Now, the other part of the limitation, like I earlier on stated, was the empirical part. Now, empirically, we can see that the World Bank Enterprise Survey had few countries that were surveyed more than once. Some were even surveyed 2 times, some surveyed 3 times. Now, some were only single-year observation. What it means by single-year observation is these institutions, their performance could be over a 10-year period, could be over a 20-year period, could be over even a 5-year period. But certain organizations or certain companies that were surveyed, they were done only for a single year, which might not give the real interpretation of how well that company or that institution has done over a period of time. Now, in summary, we can say that we find purpose and find evidence for the argument that when we turn our attention to understudied economies, state-owned firms can perform better than private ones, though only in the right institutional environment. Now, this part I'll be discussing about the relationship of this study to the Canadian economy. Now, the Canadian economy is like one of the top 10 economies in the world. It is not an emerging economy. The initial study that was done from the literature review found out that private firms usually perform better compared to state-owned firms in developed countries. But this particular research had to do with emerging economies, and Canada is not an emerging economy. In the next slide, I would further explain this. Yeah, like we said earlier on, the Canadian economy is a developed economy, not an emerging economy. So if you can look on the right, on the left, you see that leading food and beverage companies are privately owned companies, and these are the ones that perform better compared to the government-run companies there. Then on your right, you can see the leading oil and gas company. Most of them also are privately owned that have been there for a very long time. Now, to generally conclude this, we can see that the Canadian economy is a developed economy, so it proves that the private companies perform better in developed countries compared to state-run companies performing better in emerging countries, especially those that are run by the state itself. Thank you.